Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course in the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D. And I'm still using the translation that I did with Nancy Turner a couple years ago that came out from Ouroboros Press. If you're interested in a physical copy, there's a link below. But today what I want to do is, since we are up to Theorem 22 in our class on the Hieroglyphic Monad, is look at that strange concoction of letters that comes near the end of Theorem 22. And actually, all we're going to do in this class, which is the fourth of 5 installments on Theorem 22 alone, it's the most complicated theorem in the Hieroglyphic Monad, is we're just going to look at those unusual words that are not words in Hebrew and Latin. Okay, so that's all we're going to do here. Set up the context and look at what those letters mean. So, or what we think they mean. We'll solve some of them, but just up front, I want to tell you we're not going to solve all of them. However, the disclaimer I usually give right here, which is that this is an advanced class. I'm assuming you know who D is, what the monad is, and you've read up to a certain theorem. Don't worry about it this time because we're just going to look at those letters. Now, it'll be more meaningful if you're trying to figure out Theorem 22 and you're in that class. But if you haven't, this would be a great time for you to join our class. I have 4 different playlists below, one on the whole hieroglyphic monad, one on just the theorems, one on word plays in the hieroglyphic monad, of which there are many, and one to help you understand different texts that D is alluding to, particularly when the texts are not at all that common now. So let's see what he is doing in Theorem 22 with these letters. In our last class, where you did need to know all that context I just talked about, what we did was we went through this alchemical diagram or workshop, as he calls it, and looked at what the different symbols and letters might mean in the context of everything that has come before. Because in 21, he asked you to go back through the whole monad. Okay, and we got to this point at the top here where D says, we need not talk at this point about the shapes of the common and necessary vessels, nor about the materials from which they must be made. Still, it should be considered here that alpha, the gift itself, that thing right up at the top, going to meet and capture the occasion out of most secret and brief artifice of the vent. And we talked about all the use of artifice, artificial, and so on. Then you get this cluster of letters, right, in Hebrew and what appears to be Latin, saying that this will elicit the primordial sign of the Tyrian work in the meantime, until a finer and more skillful way be known. So everything in parentheses there is sort of related in some way to that eliciting the primordial sign of the Tyrian work, the great work, magnum opus, philosopher's stone, and so on. So in one way, since it's in parentheses, it's just kind of incidental, but come on, it's incidental to the whole way of creating the great work. Okay, just to show you how much we have to do until we get to the end of this, we're almost to the end of this long theorem. And by the way, that's what that looks like in its original form, which is, these actually are Latin words. These actually are Latin words, but a lot of the rest is not. Okay, so he's going to have a deduction after this. He's going to give you that chart that I gave you for homework, where understanding the first part of this, figuring out the chart ought to be fairly easy. And then he says a few more things at the end, and that's the end of the theorem. Now note, these things he says at the end, which we're not going to talk about till the next installment of our classes, in fact, our final class on Theorem 22, that last part is almost half in Greek, and it's not easy to read Greek, but they are words, so it can be translated. Now, let's look at this particular part here. And by the way, I just pasted in that V.I.T.R.I.O.M because typing one way in Hebrew and another way in Latin seemed to confuse Google Slides, so I just pasted in the Latin word. Okay, so if we look at this, there are a few things about the surrounding context that we may find important. So let's start out with when he says he's not going to talk about the vessels. Why isn't he going to tell us what they're made of? That ought to be important. If you're just joining us, that's because physical alchemy is a metaphor all the way through here. What we know is that the vessel is you, or the human trying to solve this. And the idea, since you are the vessel, that you're divine light trapped in matter, and the whole motion of the Monas Hieroglyphica is, at this point, how do you free yourself from being trapped in matter while you are still in his world of becoming, or the fallen world where time exists, and so on. Okay, so that's what's been going on in the hieroglyphic monad. When he says the gift itself, okay, that is the same semi-unusual Latin word for gift that he used right in the opening of the letter to Maximilian, munus. It's usually used for a tithe or an offering rather than just a physical gift. It's a spiritual gift. And so he has before and here referred to the entire monad as the gift. Now, alpha, though, is the gift. What do we associate alpha with? Well, we've associated it variously with many things, like the world before the fall as the alpha, but it also pretty clearly is alluding to, in the context of this theorem and elsewhere, that place in the book of Revelation where Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And that Alpha, Omega, beginning and end shows up throughout works of spiritual alchemy and physical alchemy with spiritual overtones. Okay, it becomes part of Azoth, a term I'll define later here. However, let's just continue through this. We already talked about the Tyrian work here. Let's go back and look at this most secret and brief artifice of the vents. C.H. Jostin, who did the 1964 scholarly translation, translates that spiraculi as an air shaft. Now, it's a plural word, but there are other things in the sentence that make you think it should be singular. Nancy and I also translated it as singular, as vent, but you could make it vents if you wanted. It would just make the other part of the sentence sound odd. Okay, Agnes Klein, in her German translation, translated it as a spiral, which is what it looks like. But she made that sentence the German equivalent of a very secret art of short spiral turns. She's taking some liberty in her translation there, although I really like it. And she's suggesting it is a spiral condenser. And if you remember from last class talking about that diagram, that'd work. David Oveson, pen name of the late Fred Gettings, notes that, and he's writing in Shakespeare's secret book where he has a chapter on the Monas Hieroglyphica. He says that in medieval Latin, a spiraculum venti is a blast of air, but in a theological context, it's an afflatus, the breath of the Holy Ghost. And so he suggests that Dee is writing of a skillful or ingenious blast of air that produces inspiration. Okay, so if we treat the apparatus as a metaphor, which is what we've been doing all along, it also gives you a concept of the path of the initiate moving up the tree in Asaya, what we've been talking about, as doing so in a spiral fashion. And that's fascinating. And actually, that's how I would interpret this also. In other words, the vessel or the person is not moving up in reverse lightning flash order, although they are perhaps exposing themselves to emanations of divine light in reverse lightning flash order. But if they were, zooming over here to a Sephira and over here to another one, they wouldn't obviously be going up the middle pillar. It also explains why in that diagram that D had two M's, which makes it difficult to attribute exactly which Sephira he's talking about and which direction, and so on. Those of you who are into sacred geometry and like phi or phi spirals, you can have all kinds of fun with this. I would do so now, except it would take us a little far afield from these letters, which is what I want to get to here. In this last part, D writes, any external air or wind could cause great injury in the glass. So think of this as a metaphor. It works perfectly. And if you have too strong an influx of inspiration or vision or divine light, it can disorient one. But it won't damage the body, which is what he has equated with omega, and the mortar in that mortar and pestle, or a reflecting mirror that reflects the divine. So works fine with that meaning. The man for all hours also suggests how we can attribute the glyph itself to different hours of the day. Later on, we'll talk about how it works with clock ciphers. He's also made it so you can attribute it indirectly to different parts of the body in the same way that is done in Plato's Timaeus or in the Sefer Yetzirah. So you can attribute it to different things associated with different hours. You can use it for magical timing. Think of Agrippa and magical hours, and we know Dee has a couple copies of Agrippa and so forth. All right, now we are to the fun part. What the heck is that jumble of letters that is in two parentheses, that one of which seems to be going the wrong way and ending with a bracket? Well, with the two parentheses, remember, there we just have another allusion to the double grades of the moon, because these are lunulas. That's a word coined by Erasmus, the Latin style master of the Renaissance, who calls parentheses little moons. All right, and the one is perhaps going the wrong way, because that's how it would end the sentence if you're writing the right way in Hebrew. But let's see what we can do here. Okay, so what excites me about these letters, first of all, before we even jump in, I got to tell you, is there prima facie evidence that Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica was not only an influence upon the Rosicrucians, but to me, at least, it proves that there was the oral teaching that C.H. Jostyn talked about, and that the Yates thesis, that is the thesis by Francis Yates in the 70s, that the secret philosophy behind Rosicrucianism was the philosophy of the Monas Hieroglyphica, something people have argued about since. Well, I've thought that it is true, and here we have prima facie evidence that it is. Not only does the hieroglyphic monad as a symbol appear in works, but the only way that we can figure out some of this is because of later Rosicrucian works. I mean, I'm not a dumb person, but I'm not smart enough to figure this out. And I think if we tried to figure it out with a computer, we would get so many answers that it would be useless. And let me show you what I mean. Let's look at this Latinish phrase, litro vinium. I mean, it kind of sounds like wine. We know that there's spirits of wine and stuff used in physical alchemy. It'd make sense to go that way, except this isn't a word. It doesn't appear in any Latin dictionary that I've consulted, and I've consulted a lot. And C.H. Jostyn, who was an excellent scholar of Latin along with physical alchemy, it seemed to have just kind of blown his mind. He said, well, maybe it could mean a liter of wine, which doesn't really make any sense. David Ovison pointed out a couple decades later that that measure of fluid, a liter, didn't exist in Dee's time. That makes no sense. Now, this next discussion I'm just going to bring up because these two gentlemen having it are sort of among the top lights in the study of physical alchemy. Paul Ferguson was the person who did that translation I talked about a few months back on the Voarchadúmia of Pantheus that Dee refers to. V.I.T.R.I.O.L.M has written numerous works on Renaissance physical alchemy. And so in a discussion there, they were on the alchemydiscussion.com. Prink speculated that litro could refer to a litron, which is a measurement that does exist in Dee's time. It's a dry measurement. It would better fit the context if you are doing even reflux distillation and you're taking the dry distillate out, if you're doing it, or if you're doing something like using Zosimus's dry still, I mean, it would work better. But the problem is, what do you do with it then? Because vinium isn't wine. The whole thing is just not a word. It's a very complicated notericon, as we'll see, and there isn't a way that we could solve it on our own. It takes too many steps, and if we were able to solve this, then we could turn anything into an notericon. Let me show you what I'll mean here. The way that we're going to know that it existed is because it was used by later Rosicrucians. The person who figured this out was Agnes Klein back in 1980 in her German translation. She noted that the letters in litrovenium, if you rearrange them, it spells in petroleum. It's an anagram, in other words, of a notericon used by later Rosicrucians. So Let's take a look for a minute at that notericon. Okay, V.I.T.R.I.O.L.U.M is a common alchemical acronym, and as you can see on your screen, it stands for Visita interiora terrae rectificando in bienes occultum lapidem verum medicinum, which means, according to a usual, and I would say kind of flattened out translation, visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying, you will find the hidden stone, which is the true medicine. Sometimes it's shortened to vitriol. Vitriol is now used as a common chemical compound. You also may know the adjective vitriolic, which is to behave in a kind of angry and corrosive way. That's because the chemical compounds that have been labeled vitriol are things like sulfuric acid. I mean, things that are really corrosive and break down metal, or oil of vitriol in any case. All right, so this word comes from, as a word, because that's the thing, it's an anagram of a notericon for something that has become a word. And if you shorten it, to say vitriolus, a small glass, it was a word in Dee's time. Vitriolus is a small glass, but it's used in alchemy to make sulfates if certain metals in that glass. Also, the idea is if in water, kind of bubbling up from what's left over in mining, if you see metals that are these kind of sulfates, they look kind of glassy. From that, you make oil of vitriol, which, like I said, was sulfuric acid. What you see here, this beautiful seal, is from the International Alchemy Guild. And so you might think, oh, well, isn't that nice? They're using this on their seal. Where did they get that from? From John Dee? No, that's, at least that is not what they say, and we certainly have no reason to disbelieve them. They attribute it to the Azoth of the philosophers by the 15th century alchemist Basil Valentine. More on him in a minute. And when they say Azoth, where have we heard of that before? Well, first and the last. There is this whole thing, not just with D, with Latin, Hebrew, and Greek has 3 sacred alphabets. And I mentioned it before in a video I did a couple months ago. I'll drop in the link below, on Heinrich Khunrath, that drew on the work of Peter Forshaw. And I was talking about Khunrath because he comes right after Dee. He leans on Dee's work a lot, and he says that's what he is doing, unlike people like, say, Athanasius Kircher, who just plagiarizes the whole thing and doesn't say where it comes from. So in his 1595 and 1609 editions of his Theatre of Eternal Knowledge, he puts the Monas Hieroglyphica glyph into his Azoth. I talk more about that in the video, and why Khunrath, who is associated with physical alchemy, is drawing upon Dee, who has had no success as a physical alchemist. The short answer to that is because of Edward Kelly and his success in physical alchemy, but it's a much longer story. So Azoth is a multilingual notericon where you just put together A and Z in Latin, Greek Alpha and Omega, Hebrew Aleph and Tav, that is the first and the last of these 3 alphabets, and you get Azoth. And as Forshaw says, this is thought to encapsulate the whole alchemical work, the transformation from prima materia to ultima materia, from the base matter to achieving the philosopher's stone. Now that insignia or seal of the Alchemist Guild comes from some other place here. Sorry, I keep having that pop up on my computer. It comes from Daniel Stolz von Stolzenberg in a book with a wonderful name, Chemisches Lustgartlein. But Stolz, who's sometimes called Daniel Stolzius, was a Bohemian physician. He was a student of Michael Meyer in Prague. And so Meyer, who is now mainly known for his alchemical work and his musical compositions, was also a physician of Rudolf II in Prague starting in 1608. By that time, Kelly is dead, Dee is dying, but among his alchemical circle is Kelly's stepdaughter, Elizabeth Westonia, who is a poet. One of the things Meyer does, and no other alchemist does this that I know of, is rather than just talking about how music is interrelated to all these things that you do in alchemy, Meyer actually composes music to go with his alchemical text, which is kind of cool. But the interest that I have here with Meyer is his connection to Rosicrucianism, particularly English Rosicrucianism, but not only English Rosicrucianism, also in North Central Europe. Meyer is in London in 1611, 1612. He's associated with James I, the king who succeeds Elizabeth I as ruler of England. He writes a song for the wedding of Princess Elizabeth, who is James's daughter, who marries Frederick V. They briefly become king and queen of Bohemia, the so-called winter marriage that many people think is an influence upon Shakespeare's, one of Shakespeare's plays. And then, which I can't think of the title of, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And he comes to the funeral of Prince Henry, James's son. Yeats follows all these connections through in her book, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and I'll drop in the link to that below. And so that is where she is in part tracing her Yeats thesis of the influence of the Monas Hieroglyphica on to the Rosicrucian movement. So let's go back to Basil Valentine. He is a fascinatingly strange non-individual. By the way, A Winter's Tale was the name of that play I couldn't think of. Anyway, here's an imaginary portrait of Basil Valentine with an imaginary history kind of implied by it. It's from the frontispiece of an otherwise unremarkable book that came out in 1717. And so you can see the alleged Basil Valentine wearing a monk's robe. He's holding a piece of alchemical glassware in his left hand. He's got his right hand on a book. He's got all this alchemical symbolism behind him. There's a basilisk on the table, which would symbolize the philosopher's stone. The word basilisk comes from, like basil, is a very unusual Greek word, usually thought to mean king, although its etymology is really strange. Look into it if you love etymologies. Anyway, the basilisk is resting on an egg, probably the philosophic egg. The block letters, like Roman block inscription letters around the portrait, would translate as Brother Basil Valentine, monk of the Order of St. Benedict and Hermetic philosopher. So, like I said, he's allegedly a 15th century monk, and allegedly he came up with this acronym, although nobody really believes that anymore. It is significant, though, because if it were in the 15th century, that would be before the Monas Hieroglyphica. Where the earliest we're going to get any references to him is 1599, which is after the Monas Hieroglyphica, which comes out in 1564. So there is absolutely no record of Basil Valentine before 1599, and there's no mundane record of him at all, something like a birth record, a death record, church rolls, tax rolls, prison rolls, none of those kind of things. That is, I mean, if you were tracing your family history and looking for evidence that this ancestor exists, you're out of luck. There is no evidence in mundane records that he exists. But also odd about Basil Valentine is his name, which loosely translates as King Valentine or even King of Hearts. However, in his books, the writing shows a really strong understanding of chemistry, according to those who have analyzed it, at least. And some have even argued that it's too strong. That is, he demonstrates how to do things that seem kind of odd for somebody to have been doing in the 1400s, that other people didn't know how to do in the 1500s. He demonstrates how to make oil of vitriol, that is sulfuric acid, and that's why vitriol is sometimes synonymous with sulfuric acid. But the dating, according to people who have looked into his works, doesn't match. Numerous books are published by Basil Valentine or by someone under this name anyway. The first one is in 1599, and that first one was published also by one Johann Thuelde. Now, there was a whole speculation among the very small number of people who cared about such things that really that was who was Basil Valentine. The trouble is Basil Valentine is just too prolific. He churns out a bunch of texts in the early Rosicrucian era, and then he quits. So now the consensus is that this was some group of individuals who were publishing under that name, Rosicrucian individuals. So anyway, there are others who have used this acronym who haven't been using it in terms of physical alchemy. What you're seeing there is from the chamber of reflection used by Masons. I'll talk about that in just a second. But the point here is that it is from reverse engineering this acronym of a notaricon that we're able to solve Vitrovinium in the work of D. It's not from any cleverness of my own that I can refer to Agnes Klein. There is some immense cleverness that she figured it out, but she wouldn't have been able to figure it out except that it existed after D's time and you reverse engineer it back to D. Most would say Valentine, some, myself included, would say Coonrath are the first people who use this, and they are after the time of the Monas Hieroglyphica. The associations are usually, but not always, in physical alchemy, but not always even with Valentine. The first of his works, his 12 Keys, isn't a work of physical alchemy. It's actually really similar in ways to the steps in the Rosarium Philosophorum, which, as I've said elsewhere, you can take the Monas Hieroglyphica once you understand it and apply the same concepts to the Rosarium Philosophorum. As long as you are willing to let it be spiritual alchemy rather than physical alchemy. The same is true with Rosicrucian works that come out after D, the most famous being the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, which has a monad glyph right on the chemical wedding. Okay, so as I said, that bit of eye candy you're getting there sure is from the Masonic Chamber of Reflection. And there it's, even though there are other, there's other things associated with physical alchemy. Oh, and look at that little Mercury sign there. And you have salt, and you could be a man of all hours and all sorts of things. But these are just symbols from physical alchemy that are used metaphorically. The idea, so I have been told, is that the chamber of reflection is a place where one goes to go within that person's own psyche to look for truth, and to look for truth perhaps by communing with the divine. Okay, so you can easily speculate, as I have done here, that the later uses of V.I.T.R.I.O.L.U.M come from an oral reading that accompanied the Monas. That if we put that diagram from 22 on here, we could speculate what the center of the earth is, because we've already done so anyway. The center of the earth is going to be this displaced point, the stone the builder rejected that moves up here. It is this stone that where you're entrapped by the elements, and as one moves up the middle pillar of the truth, the tree of life, you're burning out the dross, and so it, the way that this term is used by Rosicrucians when not being directly applied to physical alchemy and making sulfuric acid applies to the monad. And for that matter, sulfuric acid as a corrosive agent does too, because we've seen again and again that the path of initiation is not supposed to be easy. In fact, it's likened to a crucifixion. That's pretty not easy. That is something that if one is going through while one is still alive, it's extremely painful. All right. So that's the Latin letters. We've had some success with them. What about the Hebrew? These also are not words. Now, you shouldn't trust me on this. My Hebrew is fairly limited. It's largely drawn from initiatory groups and study of Hermetic Kabbalah. So who you might want to trust is Gershom Scholem, who was in his day the preeminent scholar of Jewish mysticism and the founder of the entire field of the academic study of Kabbalah. So let's look at this more closely, and then we'll see what Scholem says about it and what we can figure out from it. Remember, Hebrew is running right to left. So the first Hebrew word that you're going to see there, it's not really a word, but the first Hebrew letter is going to be after Vitrovinium. And the first Hebrew letter you encounter is actually a mem final, and you know a word is ending if it ends with mem because you have a mem final. So it looks like you're reading this as words because of that mem final, but they're not words. There's that screen again, sorry. So In his 1964 translation, C.H. Jostyn tells us what he's done. Now, as a museum curator at Oxford, he is able to reach out to the best scholars in the Western world, so he reaches out to Gershom Scholem. Professor Scholem is in Jerusalem, and Scholem suggests that it might refer to a chemical process because, again, they're not words. We're going to come back to that idea of this referring to a chemical process in a moment. Now, Jostyn himself thought that if it wasn't a chemical process, then it might be a printer's error, which just makes me kind of laugh, even though I have nothing but respect for C.H. Jostyn, because that's kind of one of the time-honored ways of blaming someone else when you can't figure it out. It's sort of analogous to that thing that happens later with Dee's manuscripts, where the story is that, well, this woman used them to line pie pans and burned up half of his spirit diary. It's like, oh, we'll blame the help. We'll blame a printer's error. But really, for everything we know makes us think that Dee was hanging around when Willem Sylvius printed this, making sure everything was precise, even though it's really hard to get Hebrew type then. And even though this Hebrew type isn't that great, for instance, it's kind of easy to confuse a resh and a dalet and things like that. I don't think there's any printer's error. I do think it's an unsolved Kabbalistic riddle, though. Now, as far as what other translators have done with this, Agnes Klein made no attempt to translate it, even though she's the one that figured out the Litrovinium. Hamilton Jones doesn't make any effort to translate it, nor does James Egan. But Egan is an interesting case, and I'll have a whole later video on some of his works. His Latin translation is not very good. He says he doesn't know Latin, and so he mixes up case he does. But the weird thing is, even though he's doing that, he figures out certain things that aren't about the text better than anyone else. He was the person who noted, for example, how many in Theorem 22, how many artificials there were, and how many capital A's, some of which don't translate into English, but the ones that do are like anatomy, Aries, and then all the artificials. And he also noted, just looking at these letters in Hebrew as letters, knowing no one could figure them out, that, well, there's a lot of aleph, tavs, and mem. So maybe that suggests truth, emet, but also atom in, or atomism in Greek, since that's associated with Democritus, and D is referring to Democritus, or actually a pseudo-Democritus, someone he thought was Democritus who wasn't a lot. Egan also, like I said, looks at all these capital A's. You combine this with the idea of from David Oveson about this being a kind of a flatus, this whole device that D is talking about before you get everything in parentheses. And you have a reasonable hypothesis, I think, that this means something about breathing the breath of life into a thing. That is, if you look at the other meanings associated with the letter Aleph and the letter Omega, you could easily make that hypothesis. It's not a solution, but it's a start. Now, I'll quickly outline my attempts here, and then I want to talk about why even Scholem had a problem figuring this out. And if we combine all of these things we know that are useful to us, what this phrase could indicate. Okay, so what can we assume about these letters? That's the first thing. Well, the Latin was an anagram of a notaricon, so logically this might be too. And if it is, we're up a creek, frankly, because we're going to need someone who is a super expert in Hebrew, and even then, you can make an anagram of a notaricon mean almost anything you want. So we've got to narrow down the context. First thing we'll do is maybe if we can solve it as anagrams within the context we know we have, that'll be helpful. And if that doesn't work, we'll try notaricons. So we know that in this particular part of the monad, we know, those of you who have been studying along with me all these months, what is going on here, that the vessel, this human, is freeing itself from the bonds of the elements by being exposed to divine light. That is the central and main movement, the central symbol being the light of the cross, which is already also been associated for a long time now with cones of light, divine light coming down the tree and so forth. So we're symbolically exposing this vessel, this hidden stone, the stone the builder rejected, that displaced center point of his rectilinear cross at the center of the cross of the elements to divine light. That is the central motion going on here. And the kind of default when we don't understand something, how would it fit into that scenario? So back in the very beginning of the theorems, they started with a reference to Genesis 1:3, the fiat lux, or let there be light. So if that's the beginning of the process that is acting on this thing in the center of the world, this vessel, say, it'd seem like we'd expose it to light. And already we have something we can do here, right? Because these are the first two Hebrew letters in light, or. So we have Aleph Vav. And then it gets even better because over here we have a Resh. So we can move this, maybe everything around as an anagram, and we will have or our from that same passage in Genesis as written in the Torah. All right, that's great. It looks like we're going somewhere. We can also find a let there be, which is just yod hey yod, but then it starts going downhill because we have to break out or break into, pardon me, this other group up here that is in parentheses. And so there's our two yods, but why would we have let there be and then light down here? And in fact, the easy way to do that is use the hey from here. So it starts after an auspicious start, rapidly going downhill if we do that. You can pick out other significant words. A reasonable assumption, I think, is to look at sacred words in Hebrew, sacred words associated to the kind of thing Dee has been talking about. So you can find words, say, from the Lord's Prayer in here as acronyms, like Olam, eternity, unto the ages. You may know it from Leolam. Or what is sometimes translated as heaven, really the dwelling place of God, Shemayan, those letters are in there. But at least for me, after doing this, and I've worked at this on and off since 2007, I'm embarrassed to say, it starts to feel like a fool's errand. That is, someone who was really good at Hebrew and Hebrew acronyms and the kind of things you do with Kabbalah couldn't figure it out. So I tended to think, who am I kidding? Come on. I would then remind myself, well, Dee in his letter told Maximilian about how Gematria, Notarikon, and Temura are the preeminent keys of the Hebrew Kabbalist. Then I think one reason Maximilian would be excited about that is because you can adopt those as ciphering techniques and bring them right into Latin. But you can also, with Gematria, calculate numerical values. So I did that. You can try it yourself if you'd like. Wasn't too helpful. You can look at the particular meanings of letters in the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, that was a wonderful study, and I think it was very valuable in and of itself, and it should be. But it didn't help solve this. I did notice that, and I'm not the only one who has noticed this, that, gee, there's a lot of mother letters in here, far more mother letters than other letters. I mean, in proportion to, there's only 3 mother letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but you have mother letters, Aleph, Mem, all through here, especially, and you have a couple sheens. Okay, so you can do all of these things. Now, if I use Temura, it just wrecks the beauty of what's there in terms of individual letters. You use Temura, and what you start doing, there are 3 different kinds, and any kind of it you use, you start eliminating the mother letters. Well, that doesn't seem very helpful. Okay, now there is one sequence of letters there that is both an anagram and a notarikon. It's a form of Temura if you want to stretch the meaning a bit. But anyway, right here, just as an anagram, we'll look at it. Sheen, Sheen, Mem. Shift it around and make it Sheen, Mem, Sheem, and you have Shemesh, which is the name of Tifreth in the world of Asaya, or the sphere of the sun in the world of Asaya. So that's pretty cool, but it's like trying to read light there. There's nothing else that comes with that. So I'm going to go back to the notion that worked with the Latin. The Latin was a notericon, so let's say logically this might be a notericon. Now that creates a whole series of problems beyond the Monas Hieroglyphica, and I'm going to have to just show you what I mean. The only way we solved the Latin notericon was by finding it in the works of later writers who wrote it out, and plausibly they had an oral teaching from the Hieroglyphic Monad. All right, those people are Christians. Hebrew is the sacred language of the Jews. Now, as far as I know, Christian Kabbalists and Rosicrucians have not used or explained this Hebrew notericon. The most likely candidate, Athanasius Kircher, who knows everything about everything, just ask him. He hasn't used it. That kind of made me giggle because I thought then, oh, Kircher, you didn't have all of the secret teachings, did you? But anyway, why don't we look within Jewish communities? Hold that thought. Let's look at some Hebrew notericons that aren't created by D. They're created from within Jewish communities, but they do influence later Hermetic and Christian Kabbalists and ceremonial magicians who use these notericons, sometimes without knowing where they came from. But you may know these two. They're among the most famous. Agala. So that's used, for example, in a pentagram ritual. Ra is used in hexagram rituals. So that comes from the Hebrew for thou, O Lord, art mighty forever. So you can see the Aleph, the Gimel, the Lamed, another Aleph. And the same thing with Ararita. We can trace all of the Aleph, Resh, and so on from this sentence, which means one is his beginning, one is his individuality, his permutation is one. I mean, these are really well known and really wonderful notericons. The origin of this first one isn't known, but the most plausible explanation, according to academic Kabbalists, is from the 12th and 13th century Jewish communities. Hebrew is a sacred language. Anything written down in Hebrew is not supposed to be destroyed. So you find this all over the place. You find it in spells. You find it in certain prayers. I mean, it's not unusual in any way to find Agalah in the scraps of Hebrew that remain from the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, the second one comes from real rabbinic Kabbalah. The first one might have originally also, but it's no one's found where. Okay, and according to Joseph Dan in his wonderful study, The Early Kabbalah, it comes from the Iyun circle. Now, that circle is in North Central Europe. Dee would not have had any access to that kind of circle, or if he did, which is unlikely, it would be after the monad is written. Now, 2 decades later, when John Dee and Edward Kelly are in Prague, maybe not likely, but maybe, there is, and you can trace it in Dee's diary, some contact between the Jewish circles in Prague, which are amazing mystical circles along with amazing in their self-preservation and everything else. That is where the Maharal of Prague, who allegedly creates a golem, Rabbi Lowe, is, and so on. So there is some travel back and forth between the Jewish communities, but it's probably Kelly, not Dee. And it may well have to do with finances rather than mysticism, although with Kelly, who knows, it could have to do with both. Okay, so why all of this is significant? It's because if Dee created this notericon on his own, we'd solve it by looking at works of Rosicrucians and Christian Kabbalists when those initiates decided to explain it later, but no one ever did. The anagram notericon he gives us in Latin, that's how we solved it. But looking at Hebrew writing within Jewish communities, which seems logical, isn't going to work for all kinds of reasons. I've argued in this course repeatedly that Dee knew Christian Kabbalah, and I'm certain he did, because you have to know Christian Kabbalah to explain the monad. And he uses a certain diagram of the tree of life, sometimes called the Kircher tree, but Kircher stole it from Dee, or borrowed it from Dee, who borrowed it from Reuchlin, who borrowed it from Riccio, who was borrowed it from Gikatia, who is a student of Abraham Abulafian. We can trace these genealogies back, but that is different from thinking that Dee has a really deep understanding of the Hebrew language itself. There is no evidence that his knowledge of Hebrew was anywhere near his knowledge of Greek, where he's the expert in England and perhaps Europe in ancient Greek mathematical text. It's nowhere near his knowledge of Latin, when Latin is the language of educated humanists, and that's the group Dee hangs out with. So he doesn't have any known connection to Hebrew scholarly linguistic communities. His work on Kabbalah that translates as a compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah that came out a couple years before the Monad is a table. I mean, he's not writing texts in Hebrew. Also, more to the point, Jews in Europe in Dee's time and for decades after, and I mean decades, centuries after and centuries before, have no reason to trust an agent of the crown, which is what Dee is. European Jews have been persecuted and almost wiped out repeatedly since the First Crusade, if not before that. There are a few communities, like the one in Prague, where the legend goes that the community was intact before the First Crusade. But it's much more common to find out, oh, there was a Jewish community here until the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, World War II. I mean, there is no reason for a scholarly Jewish Kabbalistic community to trust an agent of the crown. And furthermore, if it were known within rabbinic Kabbalah, the things that Dee is brought in from Christian Kabbalah that come in from rabbinic Kabbalah tend to be the basics. I mean, they're not the basics in Hermetic Kabbalah today, but they are the basics within rabbinic Kabbalah, which is a lifetime of study. And there's no reason that any rabbi would tell Dee, but if they had, Gershom Scholem, who was very good with Hebrew, founding the field of academic study of Kabbalah, he would have known about it. Okay, have I made my point? I will stop ranting and move on. So what I default to then is Professor Schollem's explanation that these letters look like a chemical formula. I can't tell you what the chemical formula is, other than it involves exposing the elements to light, and it would be a protochemical formula, the kind you would find in early works of Hebrew alchemy. Think of the discussion Raphael Patai has in his very long book, The Jewish Alchemists. Yes, he's looking at the spiritual study of alchemy, but also at early metallurgy text in Hebrew, kind of like what we saw with early metallurgy text in the Codex Marcianus Graecus 299. So I think that's what this has to be. So the kind of chemistry that we would be looking at here is, chemistry in quotes, proto-chemistry, how divine light works to transform matter. Spiritual alchemy and chemistry. If nothing else, this gives us a happier meaning to better living through chemistry. So I've mentioned my partial solution to this, where it starts out with light, or where Shemesh is there, because it fits, but I don't have any certainty at all that I'm right about that. I've, over the years, come out with two full solutions, and alternately I think, yeah, I've got it, but most of the time I think, no, that's pretty silly. If you have come up with a solution, you're welcome to share it. If you're a graduate student, publish a paper on it. But chances are that if you have spent any time trying to solve it, you too might look at your solution and think, oh, no one's going to accept that. I'm reminded of, on a slightly more scandalous level, Crowley's Book of the Law, where there is this section in the Book of the Law where Crowley gives this long bunch of things that doesn't make any sense, and someone who comes later is supposed to solve it. Well, the problem is anyone who comes later and solves it is told they're wrong and that it's silly. So I frankly don't think that this is ever going to be solved. And if it is solved, I don't think that the solution will be accepted. But I am certain that this Notaricon is, like most of the Monas Hieroglyphica, a mnemonic device. In this case, for what a person in D's second grade of the sun would likely teach someone in his second grade of the moon, his first grade of the moon. So I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that's ever going to be solved. I still think we can understand the hieroglyphic monad without it. Okay, what else here? Well, since he's setting up this structure, what does one study within that structure? We kind of know that now, don't we? All of the works that he has alluded to, superimposed over in a certain way, are what got us through the first 20 theorems. Then we brought in his hidden text, the Codex Marcianus Graecus. So the study, reflection, and meditation upon those is the bulk of the thing, right? But there might be some other things we want to talk about, and we will when we conclude this theorem. By the way, in my last video, I gave you the homework of solving this chart that also appears in Theorem 22, and also flipping Mercury as projected on the tree of life upside down. And I'm going to talk about both of those things in the next video. So if you don't have our translation and you need a screenshot of this, this would be a good place to pause this and take one. Otherwise, I'll be back in a couple of days and we will finish up Theorem 22. Have a great day. See you then.